Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If you've watched these things before, you'll know that I'm channeling the spirit of Sebastian Edwards, who's a usual moderator of these events, and a very, very good one indeed. Professor Edwards is otherwise committed today and cannot serve as a moderator for this event, so you have me instead. I'm honored to have this opportunity. For those who are wondering, I'm Ed Leamer, a longtime professor at UCLA. I started here before most of you were born, I think. Today we have a genuine intellectual speaking to us, someone who is the premier global economist when it comes to developing countries, especially Latin America. He knows more about the role of debt and inflation and exchange crises than anyone in the world. He has adoring audiences, not just among academics, but also policymakers all over the world, and also lawyers who are involved in litigation having to do with sovereign debt defaults and delinquencies. He also writes novels, but most importantly, he has a wonderful wife who's a good friend of ours. That's probably his best asset. So today, we are so lucky to have as a speaker, Professor Sebastian Edwards. The ground rules are the same. Professor Edwards will be speaking to us for about half an hour. During that time, you are encouraged to communicate your questions via slido.com, slido.com. The Slido magic number that will get you in is 38312, 38312. After the presentation, I will present some of your questions to Professor Edwards and some of mine. I remind you that a co-sponsor of today's event and many others is the UCLA Anderson Forecast. In the words of Chris Cuomo, let's get after it. Stage is yours, Professor Edwards. What is modern monetary theory?
Thank you, Professor Leamer. It's a real pleasure to be in this event that you are moderating. And let me tell everyone, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to Helicopter Money. So what I'm going to do today is talk about this intriguing idea about helicopter money and its close cousins, whatever it takes, QE, quantitative easing, and most important, I think, of all, modern monetary theory, or MMT. So I have a slide deck that I would like to share with you, to go through the discussion here. So let me start here with what I am actually planning to do. I will first discuss what do we understand by helicopter money, and then, as I said, talk about modern monetary theory, which is a favorite of progressive politicians in the US, including the very articulate Congresswoman AOC. And then we're going to look at where we are in terms of monetary policy and whether already we are in the path to helicopter money. And then we're going to ask the important question of where, if it is ever undertaken, where will it lead us in terms of some of the most important macroeconomic variables, including inflation and interest rates, and so on. So I was looking this morning for definitions about helicopter money in the internet, something that I could just get from there and put it on the website, on the slides, without much elaboration. And I found this very good description in an Indian newspaper, a newspaper from India. And we will come back to India. And I know that many of the people who are listening to us have a connection with India. So it's an unconventional monetary policy tool, which basically involves the central bank, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of India, printing money and distributing it to the public. And the term helicopter money is credited to the great economist, Nobel Prize winner, columnist Milton Friedman, the monetarist economist. So here we have the helicopter, and it's dropping money on people's backyards. That's exactly what Friedman had in mind. And if we read over here to this description, it says that back in 1969, Friedman says, let's suppose that one day a helicopter flies over a community and drops money on people's backyards. What would happen to the economy? Now, what is important to realize is that Friedman used this metaphor or this figure of a helicopter dropping money on people's backyards as a pedagogical device. And very important what it says here, because we're going to compare this to modern monetary theory. Friedman says, let us suppose further that everyone is convinced that this is a unique event which will never, never be repeated. Now, many years later, Ben Bernanke, even before he became the Fed's governor, the chairman, when he was a member of the Fed, pointed out that in a theoretical paper, this was theory, that the US government has a technology called a printing press, or today its electronic equivalent, that allows it to produce as many US dollars as it wishes at essentially no cost. And the question then has been since then, well, should helicopter money be used sometime? What would be the consequences? And it was sort of in the background of economists. It came up in some conferences. People sort of joked about it. But it became more prominent during the Democratic primary. And Bernie Sanders is a great supporter of this view. But in its version called modern monetary theory. So, and as I pointed out, so is Congresswoman AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez from New York. Now, what's the difference between modern monetary theory and helicopter money? Okay, so remember that helicopter money is giving money to people in a community, and it is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Modern monetary theory is giving money to the government rather than people, and not in a once-in-a-lifetime fashion, but in a recurrent fashion, again and again and again. And the theory or the conceptual framework behind this is that money is whatever the government asks you or forces you to use to pay taxes. And this is called the state theory of money. The state says money is what you have to use to pay taxes, and people are forced to hold that money in their pockets. And this comes back to a German economist called George Friedrich Knapp, who wrote this book called The State Theory of Money in 1904, translated into English only in 1924. Also related to some work by an economist called Ava Lerner, who said that the most important target of fiscal policy was to be functional to generating full employment. And Keynes wrote a little bit about this. I'm not going to get into that in detail unless there are questions in the Q&A period. So modern monetary theory says, well, the government budget is not like a household's budget because the government prints its own money. These are words of probably the most prominent supporter and most photogenic and most articulate and persuasive supporter of modern monetary theory right now, Professor Stephanie Kelton from Stony Brook. And the notion then is that people have to hold this state money. The government can print as much as it wants. So it's silly not to print large amounts in order to finance public works projects, good jobs for everyone programs, the Green New Deal, and so on and so forth. Now, as I said, this was an idea that was around in progressive circles, and it was occasionally discussed in academic, in I would say mainstream academic circles, but not taken very seriously. But with the pandemic, it became a possibility, and Professor Kelton was interviewed in the Financial Times a few weeks ago in the famous weekend edition lunch with the Financial Times. And as you can see here, Bloomberg thinks that it was a marginal idea, modern monetary theory, but that because of the pandemic, people now are taking it seriously. So should the Fed print unlimited amounts of money in order to help during the pandemic? That's one of the questions. That's the question that is related to the emergency. But the MMT people don't think that it should be confined to the emergency. They believe that modern monetary theory principles, that is, printing money to finance the federal government or local governments for that matter, should be a recurrent and a continuing theory. So the next question that I want, so now we know we've addressed two of the issues that I said. What is helicopter money, how it relates to its close cousin, modern monetary theory. And now I want to explore where are we in terms of monetary policy in the United States today. Are we already to this kind of policy? So I'm going to go through a number of graphs here very quickly, but it will give you a sense of where we are. Most of you or many of you are familiar with this. Interest rates, this is the interest rate that the Fed sets. It's a policy rate, the federal funds target rate. It's been reduced to 0. The Fed's balance sheet has gone from around $4.5 trillion expected to go to $9 trillion. So double, we're gonna double the balance sheet of the Fed within a very short period of time. Very short period of time. So this, it would be helicopter money that what you drop on people's backyards is equivalent to what the amount of money that they already have in their possession. Here again, we see the Fed balance sheet. The different colors are referred to different assets that the Fed has. Blue is treasuries, green is mortgage-backed securities, and light blue is other assets. Here we see the rate of growth of money. We see that there was a huge increase in money creation after the financial crisis. This was very important because the banks were weak. Many of them were failing. Here we see what's happened during the pandemic, not as large as an increase, but a very significant one. This graph is very interesting. So how does the Fed print money? What the MMT folk argue they can do? Well, it doesn't really print money. What it does is that through an accounting entry, it creates reserves in banks. And then banks have these reserves that they can lend out and then go through a process that creates more liquidity and a multiplying process. And we can see that after the pandemic, reserves in the banks increased very significantly. Now, we can also hear that see in this graph that before the financial crisis, they were very low. Why? Because the banks were trying to lend as much as they could, and they did not keep the reserves at the Fed as they are doing now. What has happened to bank credit? Well, it's jumped by about 1 trillion since the pandemic started. So we are, in a way, doing things that are related or similar because of the emergency to helicopter money or what is postulated by MMT, modern monetary theory. Interest rates, well, here we have again the straight lines. The blue is the policy rate that goes basically to 0, And we have in red the 10-year Treasury and in green the 2-year Treasury. We can see here the period when the the yield curve got inverted, which has always been, and this time it will turn out to be again an indicator that a recession is coming. And here we're seeing how interest rates have gone basically to zero in the shorter end of the yield curve. Still, the 10-year, it's about 3/4 of 1%. This is very interesting. What has happened to deposits in banks? And we can see that they have jumped by $2 trillion. Okay, so this means that people are hoarding money. They are putting money in the bank and keeping it there. And this is something that we may want to talk during the Q&A process. Okay, so this, I think, addresses the third point that I want to discuss in this talk. So we know what helicopter money is, dropping money from a helicopter in a once and for all fashion. Its cousin MMT says, don't drop the money on people's budgets, give it to the government, and the government will spend it, and this should be recurrent. And we have expanded monetary policy as a result of the pandemic in a very significant way. And we may argue we are moving maybe in the direction of a helicopter, more closer than modern monetary theory. Okay, so what are the likely effects of MMT? Well, we need to distinguish between emergency times and normal times, and we also need theory and some evidence. And the problem, as I will point out, is that we don't have a lot of evidence. Not a lot of countries have decided to have a helicopter go around dropping money on people's backyards. So we don't have the kind of data that we can use to run regressions, for instance. But I will go back to some evidence that we have from a historical perspective. So let me turn to the theory part. I say we need theory and we need some evidence. And the most important part of theory is, or the most basic one, is the quantity theory of money, which was first developed in the 18th century in an articulate way by the philosopher David Hume, who used to be a very close friend of Adam Smith. He's from that vintage. And the correspondence between Hume and Adam Smith is not only very interesting, at times it's very funny. There's a lot of humor there. But what Hume said is that at every time in an economy, the following equation has to hold. This is M is the amount of money that the economy has in circulation. So this is what we're going to increase through the helicopter dropping the money or through modern monetary theory by printing money. V is known as velocity, and it is how quickly money turns over in this economy. If people think that money is going to lose its value very quickly, then money will circulate very quickly, very fast. It will become like a hot potato. Okay, so this equation has M times V on the left-hand side and P times Y on the right-hand side, where Y is GDP and P is the price level. And what the quantity theory says is very simple. If V and Y are constant, so V is the rate at which money turns over and it's stable, and Y, GDP, is at full employment, every change in money, if the helicopter drops money, it's going to be reflected by necessity in an increase in prices. So the quantity theory of money says, if you increase M, you're going to get inflation. And not only inflation, but in the same proportion as the increase in money. Now, that may or may not be true. There's a long discussion. We have some evidence that it holds, some evidence that it doesn't hold. But it is a theory for normal times. And what is happening now is because of the pandemic, Y has collapsed. We are projecting for this second quarter, or some people are projecting, a decline in GDP of 35%, quarter over quarter. For the year, decline of 7%. So the notion that we are going to increase and it's going to be reflected during this emergency time in a proportional increase in prices makes very little sense. Why? Because it will come, the increase in money that the Federal Reserve is engaging, and that I showed you, the increase in bank reserves by 2 trillion, the increase in credit by 1 trillion, the increase in the balance sheet is going to exceed 4 trillion overall during this whole process. It's not going to be reflected on prices, at least not in the short run, because this guy has collapsed here. But not only that, velocity has declined very significantly, and people, instead of turning money over, are holding on to more money. They are not spending. How do I know that? Aha, here, deposits went through the roof. Okay, people deposit or have their money deposited in their bank, and they are not spending it. The money is not circulating. It is staying in people's pockets or in people's bank accounts. So in theory, depends on whether we are in an emergency situation or in a normal situation, a helicopter money or MMT may or may not create inflation. What will happen to asset prices? Well, we have the basic equation on asset prices, which is one of the 3 or 4 important equations you have to learn when you get an MBA. The price-earnings ratio is equal to 1 minus over R, the cost of capital, and the rate of growth of earnings. Okay, so if modern monetary policy depresses interest rates, which I showed you, we now have very low interest rates. If that is permanent, then we have a lower R. This is the equation. And we may have higher prices for assets. But if it is only short run, the theory says we're creating a bubble, and when it bursts, we may have a problem. So the theory says, be careful and analyze whether the reduction in interest rates is going to be permanent or temporary. And a very important component here is that if the increase in money creates inflation, then nominal interest rates will go up, and the rate of growth of earnings in that particular sector may not be the same as the increase in inflation and its effect on interest rates. What will happen to exchange rates if we undertake modern monetary policy? Well, again, it depends on whether this is a normal situation or whether we have an emergency. But what we do know is that in general, in the long term, exchange rates depend on relative money supplies. So if 2 countries simultaneously engage in helicopter money and the intensity is similar, the relative money supplies it's not going to change. And that suggests then that the exchange rate between those 2 currencies should stay more or less stable, even if both countries have a high rate of inflation. We also know that in the shorter run, what matters for currency values is interest rate differentials. And again, then what matters is the relative strength of the policy in one nation relative to the next. So far, ambiguous. Okay, we're saying this is what the theory says, this is what we have to look at, but there are people that are concerned about the effects of modern monetary theory. And I mentioned India at the beginning of the talk, and here we have, this is actually from a few years back, even before the pandemic. The then governor of the Central Bank of India, Raghu Rajan, good friend and a professor at Chicago Booth, was talking, this is an article in the New Yorker, about the dangers of helicopter money. And at that time, as I said, it was mostly a theoretical idea that was making the rounds among academics. The MMT people, Stephanie Kelton and her colleagues, were trying to push it in the policy circles. But this is an article that it's basically about Raghu's concerns, and his concerns is that if we print a lot of money, we may be closer to the David Hume, the philosopher, view that it will generate inflation than to the notion that we will have a great expansion in economic activity. And he's thinking from the point of view of India, not from necessarily from the point of view of the US, because he at the time, as I said, was the governor of the Bank of India. This is a wonderful quote from Neil Irwin, the senior correspondent, economic correspondent for the New York Times. And he wrote this last year as Bernie Sanders was, and his group were pushing for MMT in the future in the US. And Neil Irwin said it would be nice to have some proof of concept before it is put in place in the largest economy in the world, that is the US, also home to the world's reserve currency. It would be genuinely fascinating to watch a small country with its own currency govern itself according to MMT's theories, principles. Okay, so Neil Irwin is very smart. He runs the economic desk at the New York Times, and he says, hey, this sounds intriguing, but let's not try it here before it's tried somewhere else, and let's see what happens. And I am going to argue it's been tried many times in Latin America, and the results have been disastrous. And this is a book that I published quite a few years ago with the late Rudy Dornbush from MIT, from Sloan, on populism in Latin America. And what we show in this group, this book, is that MMT-like policies were tried in Latin America, or have been tried in Latin America again and again and again. And every time they have resulted in runaway inflation. Very large, and today we have two countries in Latin America that are sort of standard bearers of MMT. One is Venezuela, with a rate of inflation of 10,000%. You cannot even imagine what that is. And the other one, which is tried MMT to a lesser extent, is Argentina, with a rate of inflation of around 55-60%. Now, what has happened in Latin America is that incredibly large deficits in a recurrent year after year, not in an emergency like we have now, have been financed through money creation. And this has resulted in explosion of inflation. And I have a recent paper, which you may look up in the net, which was published by the Cato Institute, where I provide information on this. The main problem in Latin America that we have found is that as you print more and more money, you start to put pressure on prices, and then a little inflation starts. But people, as inflation increases, decide that they don't want to hold that much money. And they start getting rid of it and ditching it as faster and faster. And that, going back to our theory, means that velocity increases. And remember what our equation said. Our equation said mv equal py. So if v goes up very quickly, that's velocity, and m is also increasing, then the pressure on the right-hand side of the equation and on prices, because GDP is already at its max, it's very, very significant. And here I have two amazing examples. Here we have Brazil, where the monthly, this is very hard for you to imagine, the monthly rate of inflation, monthly, went to 80%. This is not 80% over 2 decades, which is what the US would have, or over 25 years, a generation. It's not 80% per year, which is what Argentina, a little more than what Argentina has. It's 80% per month. And you can see that velocity went from 10, so the amount of money in Brazil turned over 10 times in a year, to 80, okay? So what does it mean? People treat local currency as a hot potato. Why? Because it loses value very quickly. So you get some money and you immediately exchange it for goods. Which goods? Any goods. Bricks, bottles of wine, shoes, whatever is a real good that holds its value. Here we have velocity in Chile. You can see it's 14, a little higher initially than what it was in Brazil, where it was 10. And then it goes up to 26. At this point, there was 1,000% inflation in Chile. And then it declines, and now Chile is a normal country. And this is the kind of velocity that we have in the United States. So at the end of the road, I think that we can have two conclusions and more when we go to the Q&A. The first one is that it's fundamental. Maybe we have 3 or 4 conclusions. Let's see what the conclusions are. When it's fundamental to make a distinction between helicopter money, which is a theoretical pedagogical construct, which is dropping money from a helicopter into people's backyards, that will never happen. Why? Because the Fed needs to purchase an asset as a counterpart. And in the helicopter example, it's just dropping money in exchange for nothing. So helicopter, and it happens, as I said, once, and it's never repeated. Make a distinction between that theoretical construct and MMT, which people are taking seriously, which now Stephanie Kelton is in the team of economists that is working on Joe Biden's economic platform. So we have that this is becoming more and more of a possibility going forward. So distinguish between those two different policies, then make a distinction between an emergency situation and going back to normality. And although these may work and may be advisable to have the Fed print a lot of money during an emergency, it is a very dangerous, to say the least, proposition going forward. And the evidence in Latin America and in other parts of the world, for that matter, in Turkey, in Israel about 20 years ago, in other parts of the world, there are many cautionary tales. The final point is that we have to distinguish also modern monetary theory with what Mario Draghi, the chairman of the European Central Bank, called whatever it takes. Here he would say, whatever it takes, quantitative easing. And this is what Draghi said after the financial crisis. And again, it was a situation of an emergency. It was a unique situation, and it was something that was not recurrent as modern monetary policy suggests. So my view at this point is that the evidence is very much on the side of be very cautious, maybe try it now during, but very carefully, and make sure that you can undo it and that you can retire that monetary stimulus as soon as it is needed. So I will stop here, Professor Ed, and let's see where we go from here. Cannot hear you.
How about that?
Yeah, now it's much better.
Okay, so thanks. That is very interesting, but at some level very complicated. So my hope is I'm going to make it a little bit simpler. And I asked the first question, what is money? So I have the 3 items that I use for carrying out transactions on an everyday basis. I've got a $20 bill, I have a check register, and I have a credit card. It sounds to me as though your MV equals PQ, PY equation is premised on the idea that money can only be used for transactions between individuals. In other words, if the helicopter flies above my home and a $100 bill flies down, then I'm going to buy something from you with that 100, and you now have 100, and you're going to buy somebody else, or buy something from somebody else. But here's what I think. First of all, I agree with you. There's not ever going to be a helicopter money. But let's suppose that the Federal Reserve, or I'm sorry, the Treasury, which pays my Social Security every month, decides to send me $20 bills instead. So that's newly printed money. Newly printed money. What do I do with that? Well, I don't want all that stuff. 20 is enough to last me almost for the rest of my life because I have these other 2 instruments. So what I'm going to do with all that money that comes from the treasury, I'm going to deposit in the local bank and add to my credit card balance, so I can use that money if I want. And a lot of that money is going to be used to buy other assets. So some of it's going to go to the local bank, and some of it I'll use to buy equities or maybe government bonds. The bank receiving those deposits from me, all that money that sits inside the bank, they don't want it either. So they're going to buy, let us suppose, treasury bills or treasury bonds. So what looked like an expansion of money left me with only one $20 bill. The rest was returned to the banking system, which transferred it back to the government, and the government had to borrow in order to affect that transfer. So what I'm saying is we're really talking about government borrowing and whether that's wise or unwise, and not money. Money is kind of in the background, and the really critical issue is how much the federal government is borrowing.
Yeah. So I think that's a very good point. The basic issue here is that if the federal government borrows from you, you need to have the funds in order to buy the treasury bond that the Fed wants to sell to you. And it's a transfer of money. You give the money to the Fed, and the Fed gives you the bond. But if the federal government borrows from the Fed doesn't need to have any money anywhere, any funds, any assets. All the Fed needs to do is create, through an accounting entry, some deposit in the Federal Reserve's account at the Fed. And what the Federal Reserve has is this ability to create bank reserves, which is unique. And that is the main difference between fiscal policy, which is when the Treasury borrows from Ed Leamer, and MMT, where it is that the Fed borrows, the Treasury borrows from the Fed, and the Fed just prints the money out of thin air. Ed Leamer, you cannot print dollars.
Thin air. But actually, there's no printing being done at all.
I cannot hear you.
It's not printed money. You talked about printing money out of thin air. It's not printing. You're talking about deposits in the Federal Reserve. I want to know, I've got three things that I use for transaction purposes. Paper money, I hardly ever use that. I carry hardly any around. Most of it I do is credit cards, and then larger transactions with check register. You tell me how the Federal Reserve, which is buying treasury bills, has had any impact on my use of any one of these three items.
Oh, yeah. Okay, very easy. Yeah, so the Fed goes out and creates reserves at your bank, and now your bank has larger reserves at the Fed, more than it is required to hold at the Fed, and then it says, what can I do? Well, I'm going to lend some more money to Ed Leamer.
No,
they're going to hold on. They're going to send you a new credit card with a lower interest rate. And you are going to say, man, I now have a new MasterCard and it's only 16% rather than 21%. And you're going to go out and spend like crazy and buy a new flat screen TV to watch the UCLA football game because you ain't going to the Rose Bowl no more. And that's the way it's going to work.
The bottom line here is the M in your equation, the money, is not a choice of the Federal Reserve. It depends on me as well and how I react to the possibility of borrowing. So money is not directly controllable. And
you're absolutely right. That's V. V is velocity. You control velocity, and the Fed controls M. And if you move velocity, which is how much money you want to spend or not, in the opposite direction as the Fed, then nothing happens. Okay, you're absolutely right.
This is a treasury note, a special kind.
No, that's a Federal Reserve note.
No, yeah, I know, but it's a debt instrument. You agree with that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, yes and no.
So
Yeah.
I want to make the argument, you tell me whether I'm wrong, is forget modern monetary theory. Let's just talk about government indebtedness. Is that wise, particularly if, for example, when we're in this incredibly low interest rate environment? Maybe it's better to have the debt to finance Social Security and Medicare, debt to stimulate the economy. When
Yeah. Well, you're asking a different question. What is the optimal mix between monetary policy and fiscal policy? And hold on. The problem is that people are arguing that after for instance, Republicans in Congress say no more debt should be issued. And then there are people who say, okay, no more debt, but let's then have the Fed print money. And those two policies are different. If the Fed prints money to finance the government doesn't have to place those securities and doesn't have to change interest rates.
You know the Fed doesn't print money. It's the Treasury that prints money.
No. Okay. So you are an MMT person. You should talk to Stephanie.
The Fed does not have any printing presses. The printing presses are in the Treasury. You agree with that?
No, that's not true. That's completely wrong. You buy a house and you have a mortgage-backed security and the Fed buys it. The Treasury is not involved in the Fed. I showed you the balance sheet of the Fed. Half of it is mortgage-backed securities. Completely, absolutely, 100% unrelated to the Treasury.
Okay, I want to turn over to some of the students here. They're wondering about that stimulus. Bring up the issue of the stimulus and how much of that credit expansion that you're referring to is due to the fiscal stimulus rather than to any monetary policy. And do you think this is going to produce a massive inflation and even a devaluation of the dollar as a consequence of that?
Yeah, well, as I pointed out, whether the dollar is devalued or not at some level depends on what the Fed does relative to what other central banks are doing. And other central banks around the world are also expanding very, very, very drastically. Now, I don't know if you notice, I showed the euro-dollar rate. It's been remarkably stable after the pandemic. It was $1.12 to the euro, and now it's 1.09. Okay, so very, very stable. So how can you explain that you increase the number of dollars around, so the supply very dramatically, and yet the price of the dollar has not gone down relative to the euro? Well, the answer is that the euro supply has been greatly expanded. Although Mario Draghi is not in charge anymore, and the relative supplies are more or less the same. So I don't think that relative to the euro, we're going to see a significant change. Now, there is a asterisk there, which is a very important one, and that is that the Constitutional Court in Germany has said that the European Central Bank cannot purchase government securities, that is unconstitutional. And there may be a legal issue, and maybe the European Central Bank cannot act anymore. And then we would see that in that case, it's likely that the euro will go up in price and the dollar will be devalued. The inflationary danger, it's there. And I think that the Fed is very alert and has the mechanisms to retire the monetary stimulus if needed. Whether they will do it or not, it's still to be seen. But I don't have right now. I'm not worried right now. Remember, people are not spending the money. I showed you that bank deposits, have gone up by $2 trillion. People are parking the money in their banks and not spending it, and that's a problem, as you know, for economic activity going forward.
So talking again personally, the reason my accounts are elevating is because a third of the economy is shut down, and all that money that I usually spend that way is not being spent. And then secondly, the stimulus package has shown up in the deposits as well.
All right.
It's not a monetary phenomenon. Neither one of those is a monetary phenomenon.
No, no. What has happened is that simultaneously, the Fed has increased its balance sheet by about $2 trillion, buying mortgage-backed securities, municipal debt, all sorts of assets. And at the same time, people have decided not to spend. And why? Which I said in the money, GDP has gone down. So it's a combination of all those factors. And the question is, when there is there's going to be, this is related to the previous question that you asked from the Slido. Since there is so much money out there, once we go back to normal, will that be spent? And if that happens, will there be a runaway inflation? And the answer is, we don't know, but I personally, for reasons that I can try to explain, doubt it. I don't think it will happen.
So I want to add the Keynesian view into this discussion, which is that the economy has these two states, one in which it's demand constrained because demand isn't enough to create a full employment economy. The other one, it's supply constrained. And the suggestion, I think, by the MMT folks is their theory works when it's the demand constrained economy. And they can stimulate and increase output if they can provide more money through that mechanism. And that leads me into the circumstance today. Do you know what's happening to inflation in the United States today? Is that going out of the roof, through the roof because of monetary policy? Those are related. Those two things are related, actually.
Well, I already told you, and you said that if people can go out to work and there is a great decline in output, and at the same time people are holding their deposits in the bank, of course you're not going to get inflation. Inflation only comes when people spend more and there is a supply constraint. Otherwise, there's no inflation. So we are not having inflation. In fact, what we're trying to do is restore the pipes that connect the different sectors of the economy.
Well, in fact, I think the price numbers are going to come in negative. We're experiencing deflation now. Evidence of that, I've done some shopping on Nordstrom's, and their prices are down by 70%.
Well,
so there's a lot of retailers that are cutting price dramatically. That's a symptom of the Keynesian demand-constrained equilibrium.
Well, it depends on which products you. I guess you haven't been buying toilet paper. The price has been going up.
No, I've been using alternatives. I agree with that. Groceries have been high demand, but again, I'm bringing up the point that the Keynesian view is that there are two kinds of equilibria. There's the classical equilibria where demand and supply are equal, and it's a supply constraint that matters. You want to grow the economy by expanding the supply possibilities. But in a demand constraint situation that we're in by and large now.
Yeah, but Ed, that's exactly what I said when I said we have to make a distinction between an emergency situation like right now, which is very different from a normal situation where we have full employment and where velocity is stable. So we are in agreement. I pointed out that now is very different from before. And that the question that we have to ask ourselves is, should we use whatever it takes monetary policy, the Mario Draghi approach, only during an emergency, or should we expand that view that we have to be very generous on monetary policy for under normal conditions? And I think that the second, which is the MMT approach, is fraught of danger. The first,
that the monetary authority shifted from a money management, the MV equals PY equation in the 1980s to targeting interest rates. The Fed never talks about targeting M. They talk about targeting interest rates now. Why
they actually target inflation, but
they set interest rates.
They set interest rate in order to target inflation. That's through the Taylor rule. Yeah.
And there's money doesn't play a role in that, huh?
Of course it plays a role. Money is what makes the whole thing work. When the Fed wants to lower interest rates, what they do is that they give instructions to the money desk in the New York Fed to go out and buy government securities. And they purchase those securities by printing or creating money out of thin air. That's the way it works.
Okay, I have one more question that I want to raise before the time is running out. I'm going to give you a list of countries by their debt to GDP levels. And I want you to listen to the names, and I want to have you offer your assessment of whether the United States is getting into risky territory, not only with formal debt, but also with unstated debt for Medicare and Social Security. I'm going to skip the first country, which has the highest debt to GDP ratio, which is actually 240%. Number 2 is Venezuela, Sudan, Greece, Lebanon, Italy, Eritrea, Cape Verde, Mozambique, Portugal. I gotta be able to get this right. Barbados, Singapore, and then the United States. So that seems like an uncomfortable group for the United States to be in. The U.S. has 106% of GDP. That's going to go up by another 20% soon enough. But number 1 is Japan with 240% to GDP. So can you tell us whether we should all be worried as taxpayers about indebtedness and what that might imply for the health of the U.S. economy?
Well, I think that we are moving into unknown terrain, and that it will all depend on what happens to interest rates. So the truth of the matter is that before the pandemic, the interest bill of the US debt, which was, as you say, 107% of GDP, was lower than what the interest bill was when the debt to GDP ratio was only 60%. Why? Because the interest rates on the treasuries on the 10 years, they went from 5%, 5.5% to less than 1%. So at the end, what matters is the product of the interest rates and the debt to GDP ratio. So Japan has huge 230% debt with zero interest rates. You multiply those two, it's zero, right? So the key question is what will happen to interest rates? And there, one of the theories, and we don't know enough about it, is that has a lot to do with demographics. And that as the world population ages, people are saving more for retirement, and that is putting a permanent downward pressure on interest rates. And that we've seen then a structural shift in interest rates. And that seems to be the case, although we are not 100% sure about that. Now, let me just add one more thing. You stopped in your list of U.S. Of debt to GDP ratio when you got to the U.S., but the neighborhood where the U.S. resides not only has the Sudan, it has Spain, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, Belgium, the Netherlands. All of those are 90, 95. So it's a neighborhood that is populated by exotic places and also by more mature economies such as Spain and France.
Well, you're familiar with these Latin American countries that have had expanded debt and have terrible exchange crises. Do you think that's in the offing for the United States or no?
No, I don't think so. No, I think that there are. What matters is the balance between supply and demand. Latin American countries, the demand for Latin American paper is limited. So any debt to GDP above 60%, 60 in Latin America is very high. For the advanced economies, I think that 100, 110% with very low interest rates is perfectly fine. So the work that I'm doing with Latin American governments now is try to maintain your debt to GDP ratio at 1/3 of what it is in the US. So it's relative. Why? Because there is a supply and demand issue.
But would you argue that what the US ought to do is to lock in the low interest rates with 30-year borrowing and use that to do all kinds of spending?
I think that that is a good idea, and we are doing that. We're increasing the debt by 20%. Maybe we should do some more. We have to see when the vaccine is available. We have to see whether we're going to be tracking people that are have the bug, and we have to see whether we'll find some treatments.
Okay, Sebastian Edwards, that was great. We learned so much from you. And I hope that my disagreements are not misinterpreted. I have incredible respect for you and for your insights, and you did a great, great job.
I have to call you so that you tell me all those products whose prices have gone down, so I can take advantage of that, because my deposits are going up in my bank, and so we have to do that.
So with that, to end up at the end of the 1 hour, I thank you all for listening.